Everyone, it's Bookshore. Sorry if my voice is a bit deeper today. I was filming a lot, and when I talk a lot, my voice gets deeper, so I'm at the tail end of it. But today, I have finished my 8th Joseph McElroy novel, and I believe it's his 5th novel and his magnum opus, Women and Men. And oh my god, this is a doozy to do. It's the longest work in American fiction, just under 1,300 pages, and not an easy 1,300 pages either. It's the longest one by word count. Then that these pages are as big as my head, and on top of that, just look, just look how much page density there is on this damn thing. It took me the better part of 3 months to finish. Was it worth it? Let's get into the plot summary first. So, let's hold up the plot summary for a second, and let me just give you my general reaction of the novel, like this. Oh man, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Oh, also, quick tidbit. This review is going to be chopped up into segments, so if you'll see it down below, it'll be general thoughts, characters, themes, and then it'll just end up with like a wrap-up conclusion. So if you want to skip ahead or want to skip any spoilers, because there will be some spoilers strung out through the view, just move ahead. So the plot of this monolith is that it's about a character called Jim Mayne. And like every Joseph McElroy book, it's about his inner going on and his interpersonal relationships between several different characters that are close to him. But also it involves that genre-y plot that's more of a springboard to jump off of. This time, the genre-y plot being the colloidal unconscious. The colloidal unconscious being such an important part, and but it is just like just an unconscious that goes around and does Joseph McElroy narrative. I'll talk more about the symbolism later in this review as well. But the awesome thing is that, it comes from the future. So this future event comes and presupposes itself onto the basic narration of this New York middle class lifestyle, with some intrigue about economics and whatnot there, and like a Chilean government, and a lot of stuff about Jim's past and Chore Navajo myths. But to be completely honest, it's just more about Jim Mayne, and we'll get into that later. This novel is really interesting for McElroy, because it's his longest work. No other work even goes past like 600 pages. So to have a book that's almost like 3 of them worth in length for McElroy is really unique. And honestly, I think it struggles because of that. The first thing we go on to is about the structure. Now, as with the structure of the novel, and I nicked this from Christopher Robinson, so credit is due, is that it's a very circular structure, in that it takes this wide range of casting, character, thematic ideas and whatnot, and it just keeps going down, and keeps going over the same scenes, and different variations of it to the singular point, and that singular point being the unfortunate Jim Mayne. Unfortunate, not for the character himself necessarily, but just because there's not a lot to him. So you'll see a lot of that repetition with events within the novel. You go over multiple things multiple times, like the grief for the mother's death, the chore chapters with the Native Americans, different parts of Graceimmel's sex-positive group. And I believe the reason that McElroy does this is, again, his different way of doing cognition, specifically in this novel. There and that, if we have a problem, if there is something bothering us in our life, or we're trying to understand something, we don't just talk about it once. We go over it again and again and again. Let's say you have a breakup and it really hurts. You talk about it once. Okay, you talk about it twice, 3 times, 4 times. You do it again until you get some sort of understanding of the relationship. And each time you do it, you glean something new from that breakup that you hadn't gleaned before, or that relationship process, that you realize something about yourself or your past partner. And that's kind of what I get from the novel. And we do that for a lot of other things, even with our past. So the reason why McElroy goes over these ideas again and again and again is so we can experience new things and copy that cognition. The only fortunate thing is that cognition is copied 1,300 pages of the text. Quick side note, Women and Men is not that focused on in this group. I thought that was going to be a major theme, but books like Lore Warholic go over it much more. this book should have just been called Man. Another aspect about the structure of this novel is that there's two main key differentiations between the chapters. That being the short vignettes that we get with each chapter that are generally just little individual short, sweet stories, usually about 30 pages or so, sometimes even 10 pages, which makes it have the book go really quickly. And then you have the breathers. The breathers are one part incredible transcendental literature and another part annoying redundancy. In the first half, you really get those solid breathers where McElroy really goes for the perspective of an angel or a collider unconscious, or both of those combined under the same being. That being McElroy's his thematic intention that he's done through all his other novels about transcending time, placement, and character, and putting that within that character. He makes a narration and a characterization out of that literary theme that it's always trying to accomplish. And that is just peak McElroy. And it's just amazing. And it's so cool. And the best analogy I can give for it is, imagine if you had a drone flying over the city, and you're able to get all these different shots that the human eye can't see. But on top of that, you're able to do stuff that doesn't normally happen in reality. So you're able to edit it, you're able to speed up footage, you're able to slow down footage while playing sounds that are at normal speed, and doing all these crazy things. And that is what he is able to achieve for the breathers in the first half of the book. In the second half of the book, the breathers just become long and arduous, particularly three breathers right after the other, being The Void, Between Histories, one of them, and Anzia and the Hermit Inventor, all just going over stuff that we have already known or already figured out. The Void, I just can't remember too much off the top of my head, but it just kept going and going and going. I think that was a section where it kept talking about Jim as a child and his the distance between his mother and his grandmother's house, and showed different diagrams across the street and how to cross it. And it's like, I get it, like that's an important aspect for a child, and it's important for that part, but 1,000 pages into the book, it's like, why are we reading this? Between Histories, where we go to George Foley, a character that's been hinted at through the novel, who's a criminal, and seeing his endeavors in the book and how he relates, and he drops the big bomb of the collateral unconscious, of that aspect of the we that we've been hinting at through the whole novel. And that's cool and all, but his chapter is like over 100 pages, and we already kind of figured that out. And he mentions how it affects the economy and affects so many aspects of humanity, and it's just kind of like an unseen guiding hand. But we never really know to what effect. We know that the Chilean economists are kind of involved in the Chilean diplomat, but it's not really connected together, which is fine. It works better than books like Lookout Cartridge, but for so much of that chapter, and where it fails in the Lookout Cartridge aspect, is that so much of that chapter, it's focused on George Foley's life. And his life, you think, okay, McElroy doing a criminal, this can be very fun, but it's not really the life of a criminal. It just feels like the life of another middle-class New Yorker. And even his life in prison, which is hinted at some points, is not really delved into. You can probably get more of the ideation of what it's like to be a prisoner in a prison documentary than necessarily watching George Foley talk about prison. And that aspect is really disappointing. And then the Anise Hermit chapter is even more disappointing, because that's like 170 pages or so of just the chore chapters that you go over so many times in the book. And yes, chore is meant to be related to a lot of other characters within the novel, but God, we've already been through that, and we learn about some big bombshells that Jim is the reincarnation of Anziza and the Hermit Inventor, of both of them combined, like a reverse aspect of the gender fluid combination we learned earlier. But it's like, to what effect? And Anzia and the Hermit Inventor are both archetypes. They just both fit like the old man archetype, and you don't really learn much about them individually because they're both meant to be mysterious, but having them both in the chat and both explored and having these conversations about the weather, while interesting, there's nothing in humanity to really latch onto, because there's no really strong differentiation between the two characters. So it just like leads to a whole giant chapter of repetitiveness and gobbledygook, unfortunately. And because of the breathers, they're just like, at that point, I wish for the vignettes. And the vignettes at that point, while they weren't as interesting in the first half of the novel, become a lot more interesting in the second half of the novel. And that just might be because we get to take a break from the central character, Jim Mayne. Rather than me putting on that I thought of this all myself. Because I don't think this is a book that like every other McElroy book, you just can understand in one go. However, unlike every other McElroy book, I do feel this book wastes a lot of your time. Now, that's not to say this book is out of merit. There's some great stuff in it. It's just that, as you'll see when I explain more sections in the future, the first half is just so wonderful, just so beautiful, and just really peak McElroy. And it just feels like the culmination of his career, even though it's right in the middle. And it's beautiful, and I love it. It's really touching the themes on gender. And then the second half, it just condenses down to that Jim Mayne thing. And it just so disappointing, because Jim Mayne is not a character. I'll talk about him more in my character overview, but he's Link from Legend of Zelda. But he's not even a good avatar for the reader, and not even a good medium for these personal relationships, because you don't really get to see these people. He's not a voyeur, so you're not really seeing these people. You only see these people in relation to Jim, and it just leaves a lot to be desired, unfortunately. Also, the scope is just even smaller, because the whole thing takes place pretty much in New York, while Lookout Cartridge was multi-continental, and and Actors in the House took place in many different time periods. This one does as well, but it's very regulated to just like Jim's childhood and Jim's adulthood for the most part, and it just stays in New York. There's other characters, there's other countries that we can go to, like Chile and whatnot, but like it's just not touched on. And again, it's just that very, very, very insular focus of Jim Mayne and the Chore chapters, which is like these Navajo American myths, which go in combination with the future events and the whole bi-gendered space colony. The space colony stuff is fun. The space colony stuff is really cool, but it just disappears for like 800 chapters of the book, and you're just like, oh my god, can we get back to that? Because that's where a lot of the interesting stuff is. Even characters like Jace Kimball, who is like McElroy's kind of poking fun at feminism, is a really fun and great character. She's the most fleshed out person in the book. There's even implied sections where she has a greater thematic representation with Jim. This idea of reincarnation throughout the novel, the idea of double reincarnation, where two beings can reincarnate to one, which might be Jim, which I'll talk about later as well. But it's like a mirror of the space station of two beings going into one before that technology and before the material that's present for that is discovered. But it's all left to conjecture. And I feel that's what makes the novel weak as well, because in other books, we don't get all the answers, and that's okay. However, you're not having it based on the super out there sci-fi concepts. Lookout Cartridge is about a film. We never get everything onto film, but we understand what film is as readers. It's not something so far and away from us. Interpersonal relationships with actors in the house, the kidnap and Iden's kidnap, the letter in Letters Left to Me. All these things are things that are in the on-take in the very day-to-day of our lives. However, a transgendered space station that can control the weather and that can also time travel and is part of this collective unconscious? What? And yeah, you can say, like, in Plus, the brain and the jar are so far removed from us, but at the same time, the ideas about human consciousness being confined to another body is something that's been present throughout literature, and it's something most of us probably dabbled at one point, like what if I was an android body, or what if I switched bodies, or things like that. So, and while that book was very confusing, there was that key point, and it was a bit easier to get through that book as well, because it was only 200 pages as well. So it didn't feel like a waste of time. Even though that book was much more difficult, it's probably McElroy's most difficult book, it didn't hinder you with this concept for over, again, the longest book in American fiction. Another weak point of McElroy that I kind of came up through is reading this book, and it goes with the future events as well, is McElroy's disregard for if. I can tell he has roots in detective fiction, therein that all the facts are already laid out there, but it's up for the protagonist to discover them. And that is very present in this novel. Therein that there's a section where it's very imperative to Jim's life and his brother Brad, where the mom dies. But is it the mom dies because she goes on a boat, the boat comes back, so they think it's suicide, or did she get teleported? Or did she just run away? Or, did the collective unconscious get her? We never get the answer to that, and that's fine. But here is the problem where McElroy does not focus on the if. He does that a little bit in Lookout Cartridge with the if, where if his daughter's still alive or not. But then she's alive, and it just kind of like events as normal. It doesn't weigh too much on the character. I think there's a part where he even says not to think about it. And same thing with Jim's mom, where she's dead, and there's this question if she's alive or not. But it's ultimately treated as the act that she did die, and the thought of her disappearing is never really entertained that much by Jim, other than just a mere question at one point of the book. And that double thing, is she alive and out there? Did she leave us, or is she actually dead? Because there's no grave in her body, but there's a radiation coming from those graves. Yes, while I can understand us not getting the answer, it doesn't weigh heavily enough on the mental status of Jim. And the reason I really do bring this up is because if you're going to bring the future into the book, what bigger question of if than the future in itself? So there's nothing pressing. Like, there's no the reason for cloud consciousness to come back to potentially guide humanity. Is it because there's something wrong with the future, something wrong with the past? It's like a Terminator situation. What is that implications for the characters? All that is disregarded in this book, making the future section sometimes feel a little tacked on or not fleshed out, unfortunately, even though it is such an awesome and amazing concept. So I feel like with all that said, I'm going to get into the themes and characters a bit, just to flesh out the book a bit more and just kind of get more into detail about my points as well. Let's discuss the central character of this whole shebang, that being Jim Mayne, or Jim Man. And oh boy, he is a wooden block with a face painted on it. Now, that's not to say that McElroy doesn't employ this in other novels, but he does it to greater effect, where he generally has a kind of define this main character, but the real purpose is to serve as a catalyst for exploring other interactions within his life. And though Jim Mayne does the same thing, one being the character interactions being so limited, and the insular focus on Jim Mayne himself more than any other book of McElroy's, there's not much there to latch onto with him. You get a sense of him. The best sense of him is when he was close to his relationship with Sarah, and how they found each other, how they got married, and the eventual divorce much later in the book. And you get a great sense of him, but just kind of like in the same vein of female characters, the criticism is that learning a character through their interactions with relationships and their significant other doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about the character. So it's a reversal of that feminist ideology, where learning about Jim through his relation to his wife, it's great, and it should have been early in the book, but it doesn't still give us a lot of credence to who Jim is as an individual, which is so imperative, because for the 1,000 pages before that, we see Jim in his working life, we see Jim interviewing Foley as a prisoner, and we even see Jim so much in childhood, and there's just so very little to latch onto. Actually, a good example of this is with Foley, where it's the prison interview. Well, he's interviewing Foley, but interview is kind of a misnomer, because I don't believe he asks Foley a single question in that prison, and Foley just opens up so much to him. Taste of Bad Republic on Instagram brought up a great point, is that was the chapter that really cemented Jim as such a passive protagonist. He's not playing any psychological games, he's not asking any questions, he's just there receiving information. And can you say, well, Ben, isn't that a fact of a lot of McElroy books as well? But at the same time, a lot of the characters in McElroy books, I do have an impetus and do have a searching quality from Actors in the House. He's curious about the actors who got slapped, so he goes up there. Lookout Cartridge, intercontinental travel. Letters Left to Me, even though it's passive in a lot of ways, he still is trying to define himself and trying to define what his father's letter meant. Even there's a discussion at the end of the book with the potential love interest. So this one, to such an effect, Jim Mayne just doesn't do much. So that just leaves his interpersonal character interactions, which again, is largely left to be desired. His interaction with the children are sparse. His interaction with his ex is kind of sparse also. It's only really good in that one chapter, but it doesn't go much away from the prototypical husband, or like, his relationship with his girlfriends as a kid, just him being a little shit in some areas. It doesn't really go far as well. His grandmother Margaret, the main focus of that is the Navajo chore thing, and living the two biggest interactions with his life that being his mother, which I talked about earlier in the if section. So there's not too much of the exploration of his mother explored there, just more of like the if, and if she's dead. And even then, not too much of the exploration of how it affected him, but more so how it affected his brother, Brad. And it's a lot easier to contrast Jim with Brad, because while Jim is a stoic figure, Brad is a lot more emotional. His mother's death affects him so much more, and he cries so much more. And then Brad's relation with the stepfather, who is not Jim's father, but is Brad's father, and seeing how he's just a lot more strident, a lot more stringent, and it doesn't affect Jim too much, but it affects Brad a lot more. And you see Brad as this really a bit more, not in a negative sense, but delicate and sensitive, where it just, being the younger brother, just things just hit him harder in life, and he doesn't have the proper father figure there to help him, lead him through that, and that does get Jim angry. Jim is not also the older brother figure to really help Brad. There's almost a sense of disdain for Brad. And one chapter I thought he almost killed Brad because it was over him, like choking him, but he doesn't kill him, but he's just choking him. And this goes into the part also where Jim has that similar disdain for his spoilers, but his brother Spencer, who is almost like a reincarnation of Brad, but a current reincarnation. But so, Jim is almost seen as a strong character, but not really, just because you don't really see him do any feats that are strong, or any characterization that is strong, or seen as like, wow, what a well put together person. He's just more contrasted with his more emotional brother Brad, who was emotional at the time because he's a kid who lost his mom. So could you really blame the guy? How are you supposed to react to that? Now that I think about it, Jim is kind of the weirdo for not reacting more to his mother's disappearance, suicide, death. So Jim, and just being such the central figure and just the insular focus of McElroy, I really wish he would have just done what he did in Pulse, or just something else where he could have just really, really, really explore this character. But it just is very undeveloped and just leaves a lot to be desired. Another very interesting character in the book is Jim's future son-daughter. I said that correctly. Where it's from the future, and it's his daughter and his son who both went on that teleporter to go to the space station and have combined into one as a genderless being. Jim, in typical McElroy fashion, has a polite, incestuous relationship with them, where he takes them on a date where they are in the shower, and then they eventually go take a car ride to see a movie. And in between all that, Jim is thinking of all these different thoughts and thinking of all these different social interactions outside of that. And this is contrasted by his daughter Flick, who is in the real world, who is implied to has some gender ambiguity to her, in that she rejects her name Sarah to go with the name Flick, but she later adopts it. And she kind of more of a part of Jim's life and is more present there, as opposed to her brother, who is pretty much left the family and is not in contact at all and just focusing on his job. The issue, again, with the character of Jim's daughter's son, it's not the fact that McElroy doesn't use the phrase "my brother" from a time-traveling intergalactic non-gendered mother, is that they disappear. They're only in one small breather of vignette, and you don't see them for the rest of the novel, really. There's implications here and there, but it would be great to have them there more, because they are so important to the thematic setting of women and men, of women pitted versus men, and not in an antagonistic way, but them two always being separate. And why they're so important is that to have that combination, to have both two people in the same character, to have that heavy sci-fi concept, we would have been able to explore that a bit more and see what it is to have both genders combined. And the important part too is that McElroy touches that as well in the end of the novel, where Mayne talks about how even if you're just two beings combined into one, you don't really escape human struggle. You don't really escape the mundanity of life. You don't, as St. Augustine would say, what is closer to myself than myself? You can't escape yourself. So even if you're this transcendental being who transcends gender, human ideation, human schemas are still a very much strong part of your life. And you can kind of see that there when in the shower scene on the date, where his thought process is almost schizophrenic to a degree. I would say more it's just McElroy's style of writing, but his thought process is all over the place, more so than other chapters. He's having a dialogue with his showerhead, or his showerhead is having a monologue with him. And his brain just almost seems expanded by being with this time-traveling being. It's not like he's gone into divine thought or he's transcended the human world. If anything, he's more acclimated to the human world, thinking about those interpersonal relationships and the ontic relations between him as well. So just going back to that thought, like, just because your mind expands doesn't mean you escape this reality of being human. And it would just been so nice to see more of that character and other characters in the novel, because it's implied to be the angels or the colloidal unconscious, but it just kind of dropped. Now, one of the central characters in the novel is actually one of my favorites, that being Graceimmel and her sex-positive circle jerk group. I'll get into that. But she is such a fun character, and she's actually the character with the most personality to her. She's the most well-defined person in the whole book, even though we don't get a lot of her, and she is more tangential to a lot of the character experiences in the novel. More people speak about her than you actually see her. Now, she is a critique on feminists for McElroy, and McElroy was intimidated by the feminist movement, and this led to a bit of controversy in our group. Not much, but just a little discussion, like, is Graceimmel's depiction of women, like, harmful? And I would have to say no, because this positive circle sex ed group, I've heard of stuff like that, where I've heard women's groups saying to women, like, hey, your power is your sexual organs. Now, I don't agree with that, but obviously we can show things in literature that we don't agree with. And if it's critiquing on something that's actually kind of happening out there, even though it's a little bit exaggerated, but not too much. I mean, was it Gwyneth Paltrow who used coffee enemas or something like that? So, this is not something too foreign to us. So, by that regard, I wouldn't say it's a quite negative depiction, and also it's the most fun character in the whole book. Everybody in my reading group just said, like, yeah, she's great. So, but a lot of characters, and the female characters are related to that group, being that characters like Clara and Louise. Louise being one of my favorite characters in that she's an opera singer and she has an affair with the Chilean diplomat, but a problem arises with that we see in the female characters, that we see in the male characters as well. That being not well defined and feeling more like stereotypes or archetypes. And it's really disappointing there in that, speaking of disappointing, don't tread on me flag, there in that if I was to put Clara and Louise next to each other, outside of occupation, there really isn't any truly defining characters, which is disappointing, mainly given the fact that Clara and Louise have a big thing in relation, in that Clara, who is married to the Chilean economist, and Louise is cheating with that economist on Clara. So they had that connection of both having the same sexual experience with a man, but it's really touched on. A cheating example is touched on in a group at a diner, but it's about a man named David, somebody who is not a central character. And this is just one of the vignettes, so even though it's a great scene, it's very disconnected from the rest of the story, where if that focus could have been placed on Louise and Clara, you could have just a much more interesting dynamic in that sense. And even though this women's group was meant to be bonding, just the animosity between two people, and just like how navigating that social interaction of cheating between these women who are meant to stay together so tightly. But we don't get that, unfortunately, and the characters feel largely disconnected and separated from each other. Come on. Come on my video. Oh my God. So the title of this book, called Women and Men, is obviously, you think about women and men, it's more man than women and men, in that it places too much focus on George Mann, M-A-Y-N, his last name. And it starts with a beautiful chapter about pregnancy, all the psychosexual stuff that goes on within it. Not that I'm a fan of Freud, but like just the thought of like orgasms, the husband getting hard doing it, her thinking of past lovers during the birth, what it's doing to her body, the placement of both the couples, the nature of the relationship. And it just sets off this strong integral, because what is the most important thing between women and men is that child rearing, the continuation of our population. giving birth to that which will be our progeny and be able to go into the future. And it's such a strong thing, but then it slowly diminishes. And there are a lot of different variations of the theme of women and men, like mainly between friends. It does explore Jim Mayne and his relationship with his wife, but it just kind of disappears into the void that is Jim. The Breathers, you get a lot of different relationships, like the attorney who goes to hang out with the Jim, which is one of my favorite chapters. You know, his wife coming into Jim's apartment, and he's just kind of like, oh God, is he having an affair with my wife? And he just lost his job that day. But then him and Jim just have a real honest, beautiful dialogue with each other where they just kind of go over their past and their lives. But then it turns out that his wife knows and, is kind of attracted to Jim, but she's not doing anything with him. It's just one of those things where it's just misinterpreted and there's nothing really there. And I love that stuff. I love Graceimmel ideas with his positive sex ed group, which is totally like, second or third wave feminism, more the radical side as well. But it just doesn't delve into it as much as it really should.
That's it. Another big point of symbolism in this novel is the angels. And the angels is kind of disappointing because it was such a genius concept for McElroy, because what it was a characterization of all the themes and writing styles he was trying to get at in his other novels. That being this sort of unconscious being that we kind of able to see all these characters through all these different perspectives and just like go beyond setting and time and just even in mid-sentences go between thought and just be able to go there. And he crystallized that into a character who literally does that, who uses the pronoun of we, the we of the two beings combined as the angel and the we of all of us as a collective unconscious. It's even called the colloidal unconscious within this story. However, the problem with that is that it goes away near the beginning of the story. It's present, and it's present in all the breathers, and it just kind of disappears and comes towards the back. Now, what it is, and bear with me, is that it's pretty much there's a future space station and a special piece of metal. I think the space is called Locust T, or the transport station, is that two beings of different genders go onto that metal transport and then get transported as one being onto the space station. So they have that both individuals and the same consciousness, but it becomes one. So like this genderless being on the space station that could also travel through time. Yeah. But it's such a cool concept, man. And McElroy is able to play with it to such a beautiful degree and integrate it into his narrative, into all his themes that he's trying to get at. And he's able to shift between all these different characters. And it's just immaculate and beautiful, and it disappears for like 1,000 pages. So it would have been amazing if he kept that aspect going to it. But later we find out with Foley in the prison chapters that the angels have the colloidal unconscious. It's almost like a cloud that kind of goes through the world and has a lot of effects on the human actuation than we realize, and it's even affecting the economy of the world as well. It's just a really beautiful concept that sadly goes unexplored, and unfortunately, it's, in my opinion, it's one of McElroy's strongest concepts and peak McElroy.
Now, another huge piece of symbolism in this book is the Chore Stories, that being the childhood stories that Jim's grandmother tells him as a kid. And these are fun and cool, but it's the most beat to death part of the novel. But basically, the pseudo-Navajo stories about a Navajo princess, the Princess of Chore, and the prince escaping their family to go on these wild adventures and see all these crazy, beautiful things, like people like the Anza, the hermit inventors show up, a giant eagle, a giant egg, a crazy wolf that gets eaten by the eagle. All this cool imagery and stuff like that, and even this cool story with a gun that gets passed down for generations, which is kind of tangentially evolved. But the problem is, it's just so singular focused, and probably 400 to 300 pages of the novel are dedicated to it. And again, it's just that repetitious fashion where we just learn a little bit at a time. Now, the merits, and I think what McElroy was trying to get at it, is the idea that the stories told for us from childhood, and even myths that we learn today, are meant to reflect a greater something. And even though they're very beautiful, and they seem so childlike and whimsical, it actually reflects a much darker story at play. You find out later that all the people within the Chore Stories are actually based off of characters in the real world. Like Margaret is the princess, Alexander is the prince, and they actually leave the situation to escape to a better life. And I think what it's getting at is like it's only this one middle period. So you have the future right here with Empress, future slash present with Jim. It's very realistic, very staunch in reality. You know, the past, which is also very staunch in reality, just in a different time setting. It's only this middle portion, this fabrication that Margaret makes, the grandma, in order to tell Jim these stories with a filter of childlike wonder. And it's only within this imaginary period. However, and it's only within parts where the story becomes imaginary, becomes whimsical, and has so much focus. But much like in our own lives, these stories we hear as kids are so tantamount and important to us, and often inform ideas of us later on in life. However, they do reflect that darker narrative, and the time period that they're actually talking about within the story, the tone, the presence, the themes, the heroicism only exist within that imaginary retelling. Well, if you to look at the whole timeline as one, that childlike wonder never really was there. It was only within the space of Margaret and Jim, and Margaret telling Jim these stories. In some ways just to entertain him, and in some ways just to hide him from the dark realities too, but those dark realities are always present. Like as you see with Jim's mom passing in his childhood as well.
So there's a constant ideation of weather, something like the coastline trying to map out human consciousness, and we're never really given a super very clear answer as to what the characters in this novel are getting at when it comes to controlling the weather. George kind of puts the theory that it's an idea of that if we can control the weather, we can control everything, because we get rid of the theory of chaos, and all particles can be under our submission, and everything can be predicted. But it's never explicitly stated within the novel itself, and I feel like there's something more that I'm missing in it too. Maybe it just relates back to like Navajo mythology or Indian mythology, in that the weather is so important. These mythological figures are so designated by the weather and at the whim of it. And if we can control that, we can control the means of human production. Just like in the space station where they have their own artificial weather so they can grow food and water at any time and be self-sustaining. Maybe it's that sense where we're trying to get to the next phase of human technological development. But it's often kind of ambiguous, and there is not the best meaning behind it. Also, there's also funny symbolism with the weather too, like the giant foam towers that go up the waterfall that Nziza always talks about, and then we see it at the end of the novel as well. So there's a lot to be left on that. I had a theory slightly where kind of like the spiraling structure of the novel, think about the weather kind of goes over the earth, and it spirals over the earth, and you can kind of, the more you go over the earth, the more you see that, as well you see the different depictions of the earth, and it happens constantly, but it's still fuzzy.
Another very common aspect of symbolism in Ram is the idea of breath. Now, we already talked about with the breather chapters. And unfortunately, those chapters are great at the beginning, get smaller in focus into the end, but get longer in page count. So you're dying of oxygen overexposure. But breath is also mentioned so much throughout the beginning of the novel. It's right in combination with the angels as well. And, that corrects on the meta-narrative where angels and breath are kind of seen as intertwined, and it's these breather chapters where we're able to see all the characters and experience each person's vantage point, and also with the angels being able to have that ability to view all of that. In a lot of ways, if you consider breath, I got this idea from In Jamaica, from Clive Barker, being that the idea of the Greek word phenom or phenom, I might be saying it wrong, but also it's the etymology of the word phenomenon, phenomenology, the idea of things that appear, the appearance of things. And whether you want to take a more structuralist or a post-structuralist account, be structuralist being more, this is the world that we live in, and we're able to lay the foundation for how we understand the world through language, how we're able to rationalize the world through language. Or the Judith Butler and Benjamin Wolf hypothesis, found that language creates our world, and everything about the world, everything is that constructed through it, which there was a lot of problems too. But regardless, I think that's what some of McElroy was trying to get at a little bit, that Earth is there to explain the world around us. It is through language that we're able to understand and rationalize the world, and just as the angels seeing us and being able to get that whole aerial viewpoint of all the characters in the novel, it is through breath, it is through language where we're able to understand it. That's why it's happening in the Breather chapters. But I could be totally wrong. So two small bits of symbolism in the book that, while not necessarily super imperative to the plot, I think do a great job of demonstrating McElroy and what he's trying to get at in a lot of his novels. And that being the rocket launch in the beginning of the novel and the Statue of Liberty that's mentioned throughout. And this is important because the rocket launch, where Jim sees the rocket launch and eventually meets the Chilean Apollo diplomat and his wife Clara, is important because Jim almost has like a spiritual experience. Like the rocket is described in such a beautiful way and at great length. And the interesting thing about that is McElroy had a very similar experience where he experienced, I think it was one of the Apollo launches, if I'm not mistaken, but where he saw that and it was almost like a divine experience for him. And that's it by his own words as well, maybe not necessarily divine, but to spiritual to some degree. And again, with the Statue of Liberty, which referenced throughout, it focuses a lot on how it was built, why it was built, how the French gave it to us, how the copper changed throughout history. And a lot of characters just kind of see it and ruminate on this. And this relates to an essay where McElroy has about going throughout New York, just picking up little tidbits by ear, seeing the Statue of Liberty and then seeing a Buddha statue, and just kind of coming to that idea of the mundane. And, we don't understand everything, but there's a beauty and divinity in the mundane. And the conclusion he comes to in the essay applies to both of these objects, where in that even though Statue of Liberty, the symbol of our freedom, and space exploration are very important, by a large degree, they're also kind of seen as in the background now as well. People don't go to them for a spiritual experience, even though, if you really think about it, in a lot of rites, there was an absolute reason for them to do that. While they might not necessarily represent gods of the old days, it represents freedom and human exploration, like I said earlier. And if you also, if you look at a lot of objects that are worshipped, that are seen as spiritual, seen as sacred, like Stonehenge that he mentions in the Lookout Cartridge, even though we don't know the exact divinity or gods behind that, there is a spiritual nature to that. And I think what McElroy is trying to do is bring it back to the rocket and to the Statue of Liberty, because it's been excised out of it completely. And even though he focuses on the construction of them a bit, that doesn't take away the divine aspect away from them. Much like we focus on Stonehenge and why it was constructed, or the pyramids and how they were constructed, there's still that spiritual divine aspect behind them. So why should that be absent from the Statue of Liberty? Now that's to say, with everything, I don't hate this book. This is not like a 1Q rate 4 or anything like that. There are definitely merits to this book. I really feel this could have been a slamming 600 or 800 page book. In Fantasyland, I'd prefer a situation where all 1,300 pages were kept, but it just had a wider scope than Lookout Cartridge. This is not his magnum opus. I couldn't put this up there with Ulysses and Gravity's Rainbow, and I think the disappointing thing is, at the beginning of the novel, I was getting some inclinations, and so were other readers, that this could go beyond them. It just felt so important, and it felt like it was finally reaching that idea of we, that idea of all of us, of that collectiveness. And then it just focuses on the non-character of Jim Mayne, which is just so sad. But I will say that, some of the sci-fi stuff in this novel is so damn cool. Like in the last chapter, there's a matter-destroying bomb where it does not affect humans, and it just destroys buildings, and it goes really in-depth of the implications of that. And then also on top of that, kind of shows like how the angels were formed, and how like in human thought, their brains started decaying away, and the thought process started to become crazy, and they can communicate with each other. So it shows the first things of, the angels. And all that stuff, when they address, is awesome. Even the Chore chapters are really cool, but it's just not enough. But there's too much of one and not enough of the other, and it just it's just a disproportionate book, unfortunately. And I know we cut a lot out, but I'm kind of glad you did, because I think more needs to be cut out. But I really felt like this book could have been the peak McElroy, could have been the culmination of his career. I will say, one thing that I'm thinking of is that, how will this book affect me in 10 years? Because, if I'm going to reread it, it's probably be 10 years. It's not going to be another 5 or anything like that. But I had an inclination from Actors in the House, wherein that I call that an old man novel. Sorry, my voice dropped again. An old man novel, therein that I feel like I would have enjoyed it as an older person. There, where the smaller things of life are more focused on. There's not so much that rush as in youth to get things done. You have your time a bit more. It's like when you speak to an older person, and it's a bit more slower and methodical. Would I enjoy this book 10 years from now? I'll be like 39, 40. Would I enjoy this book when I'm a bit older and I'm not trying to establish myself in the world, and I'm more established and I more have the time in some sense? Not saying you get more time when you're older, but it's like, okay, a year is nothing. A year is like 2 months to us now, so let me just take my pace with this novel. Let me just maybe read it slowly throughout the year, and just going through each chapter and each repetition. Would that be more satisfying to me? And the answer is, I don't know. I'll know in 10 years. But I have a lot to read other than that. But yeah, the definite killer of this book is the repetition to redundancy. But there is also a lot of merits in the book. Some of the early breather chapters are some of the most beautiful things you'll see in literature. And some of the sci-fi concepts are some of the coolest sci-fi concepts you'll see out there as well. Would I recommend this book? That's a very difficult one. A part of me wants to say no. Definitely not to anybody first going into McElroy. Definitely not. I know some people did, and hats off to you. It's not a difficult book, it's just more of a time-consuming book. I would probably recommend this book to more McElroy fans. If you've read Lookout Cartridge, if you read Actors in the House, plus Smuggler's Bible, Heinz Kidnap, and you've loved those books, definitely check this one out. If you're a completionist, absolutely. But if you're not really feeling the inclination to read a 1,300-page book, I wouldn't have any strong arguments to go for it, to be honest. And that's pretty sad to say. I still love McElroy, don't get me wrong. I still place him next to Pynchon and Joyce, but I don't feel like this was his strongest effort, unfortunately. So that's what I feel about Women and Men. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's any elements that you want me to cover. I will say this: stuff like the lunar economy, the weather. That stuff I need help on. I didn't understand, even all the economics in the book as well. I know I didn't understand every single bit of this book. However, if you have a bit more things to say about that, leave it in the comments below. Make your own video. We definitely need more videos on macro. I shouldn't be the only one on here, and I won't be. I know Ryan at the Taste of Bad Republican, Chris Leaf by Leaf, are gonna both do marathons on him, which would be great to have more differing opinions than my dumb one. Yeah, we definitely let me know on the parts that I missed or what you thought of this book. If you love this book, let me know down below. This would be a book I wanna love, but it's just not there for me right now. I still hold Lookout Cartridge as his Ulysses in a sense, or his Gravity's Rainbow. That's his magnum opus. But yeah, thank you for watching the review. It was a honkin' stonker, and have a great day.